Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll
And
start.
sorry to interrupt you. Please concentrate on the information because in the final exam there will be questions including your presentations. So your presentations are a part of the course material. Okay? So just concentrate on the idea we discussed because I will ask questions in the final above. You can start.
Okay, so hello everyone. Today, Lina and I will be discussing a comparative analysis of three liquid biofuels, which are bioethanol, biodiesel, and bio-oil. So we'll start with a brief introduction, then we will define what are liquid biofuels with a bit of history, and then we will discuss the three different types of liquid biofuels, followed by a comparative analysis, first a qualitative, then a quantitative analysis, and then we will finish with the limitations and the conclusion and recommendations. So, as most of us know by now, we've been experiencing lately in the past few decades global temperature rise, warming oceans, sea level rise, shrinking ice sheets, and many others extreme events, which are all signs of a rapid climate change happening worldwide. So this requires us to take immediate action. And one example could be, for example, working on alternatives to decrease greenhouse emissions. And we can do that by using possible cleaner alternatives, such as liquid biofuels, which are alternatives mostly to transportation fuels. So in this presentation, we will compare three types of liquid biofuels, which are bioethanol, biodiesel, and bio-oil in terms of their conversion technology, environmental impact, and economic viability.
Okay, so now just for a brief definition of what liquid biofuels are, essentially they are fuels that are derived from biomass, and they can be categorized into three groups: the first generation biofuels, the second generation biofuels, and the third generation liquid biofuels. So what differs between them is basically the source of feedstock. The first generation biofuels, their feedstocks are mainly sucrose containing or starchy materials, and some examples are shown in the figure here. So it could be corn, wheat, or sugar beet, or anything like that. As for second generation feedstocks, they're mainly lignocellulosic biomass that are basically agricultural waste, so wood, straw, grass. And third generation feedstocks are algal biomass. So they can either be microalgae or macroalgae or anything like that. So now for a brief history. Prior to the 20th century, transport fuels, liquid biofuels were used for transport fuels and in the automotive industry. However, around 1940s and the end of World War II, the development of biofuels and a particular bioethanol came to an end due to the drop in the price of petroleum-derived fuels, so their demand increased. And in the 1970s, there was a regain in interest in liquid biofuels. And in the 1990s, however, the crude oil prices rose, and certain countries like the US and European countries started developing policies for basically the use of liquid biofuels and the production of them. And as of today, liquid biofuels amount to 4% of the total transportation fuels, and hopefully in the future they will be increasing. So now Jenna will discuss the first two types of the liquid biofuels.
Okay, so the first type of liquid biofuel studied in this project is the bioethanol. And it's a first generation liquid biofuel, which is usually produced using sugar or starch-based crops, such as sugarcane, sugar beet, corn, or wheat. And as for its yields and quantities, they usually depend on the feedstock used. So for instance, a wheat feedstock origin would lead to 7.74 tons per hectare of land, while a sugar beet origin would lead to 53.2 tons per hectare of land. Now, when it comes to the conversion technology used to produce bioethanol, uh, as mentioned earlier, the feedstock is sugar or starch-based plants. So we usually start by converting starch to ethanol using two different steps, which are the liquefaction step, in which we make the starch soluble, and then followed by a hydrolysis step to produce glucose, which is then fermented to produce bioethanol. So as we can see in this figure, the biomass, such as sugar canes, for example, is first pre-treated where the hemicellulose is solubilized. And then once the starch becomes soluble, the cellulose is converted to sugar through enzymatic hydrolysis, which is then converted to ethanol through fermentation. Then the ethanol obtained is sent for distillation and evaporation to finally get biofuel, bioethanol, which is the final product. As for the waste, it can be recycled and sent to undergo filter washing and waste management, while lignin, the byproduct, can be used in heat production, which can be discussed later in the applications. Now, moving to the environmental impact of bioethanol, it has a greenhouse gas emission of approximately 44.9 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. As for its net energy ratio, it's 1.81, which is higher than 1 and hence not really desirable. As for its water requirements, it requires 3 gallons of water to produce only 1 gallon of bioethanol. And overall, it's considered 15% more efficient compared to other conventional fuels. Now, when it comes to the cost and application, the production cost of bioethanol is between 0.28 and $1 per gallon, and the majority is for capital cost and raw material cost. And its selling price is between $1 and $1.45 per gallon. And as mentioned earlier, it's mainly used for transportation. So it's a transportation fuel alternative, greener alternative. And it can also be combined with a heat or power plant to provide heat and electricity to close neighborhoods. For example, if we look at this figure, we can see that the byproduct, which is lignin, is sent to the power plant, which in exchange gives back to the ethanol plant steam and electricity, which is further used to provide heat to the neighborhood. Now, the second type we studied is biodiesel, which is also a first generation biofuel. And it's usually produced using edible oils and and lipids, which are reacted with alcohol in the presence of catalyst. And the feedstock origins also range between plants and animals, consisting of long-chain fatty acid esters, such as soybeans and rapeseed, and also some other organisms which are around 70% made of intracellular lipids, such as molds or yeast, for example. And similar to bioethanol, the yields also depend on the feedstock origin of the liquid biofuel. For instance, a soybean feedstock origin would lead to 70 gallons per acre, while canola would lead to 92, and corn would lead to 51 gallons per acre. As for the conversion technology, it consists of 3 different steps. So first, the biomass, first we have the hydrolysis of the biomass to carbohydrate. Then the carbohydrate undergoes a fermentation with microorganism to produce oil, which is microbial oil. And this oil is then sent to transesterification in the presence of alcohol, such as methanol or ethanol, to obtain biodiesel. And this transesterification step can either be catalytic or non-catalytic. So if it is catalytic, it requires the presence of a catalyst such as alkaline, for example, while the non-catalytic transesterification is also called supercritical because it requires supercritical conditions such as very high temperatures and pressures. And this is relatively new, so they're recently studying it, but they still prefer the catalytic reaction since it has a higher rate of reaction and it requires less amount of energy when a catalyst is present. Now for the environmental impact of biodiesel, the greenhouse gas emissions are 22.4 grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule. The net energy ratio is between 0.15 and 0.5, which is less than 1 and hence desirable. However, it requires a lot of land for its biomass plantation, which often leads to higher emissions of nitrogen oxides, which is not very desirable. As for its water requirements, it requires 82 gallons of water to produce only 1 gallon of biodiesel, which is relatively high due to the high amount of irrigation water needed. And overall, it's shown, when compared to conventional biodiesel, it's shown to have a better lubricant property and the better biodegradability and the lower emission of sulfur and carbon monoxide. And finally, for the cost and application, the total production cost is between $1.13 and $2.64 per gallon, and the majority of this cost is for the raw materials, while the selling price is around $3.5 per gallon, which is a bit relatively higher than the bioethanol price. As for the applications, it's also mainly used for transportation fuel, as a transportation fuel, and it can also be used in heating systems and boiler fuels as a boiler fuel. Lien will now continue with the third type of liquid biofuel.
So the third type of liquid biofuel that we decided to discuss is the third generation bio-oil. As mentioned previously, a third generation biofuel has a feedstock of basically algae. In particular, to produce bio-oil, the feedstock is microalgae. It's known to be more efficient and a productive source of energy when compared to macroalgae and terrestrial crops, which were basically the feedstock for the previously mentioned biofuels. Algae in general, they are basically eukaryotic species that use light and CO2 to produce biomass. So this would be the case for microalgae. Common types feedstock basically used to produce bio-oil are those here mentioned in the slide. So as for the conversion technology, generally to produce from starting point microalgae all the way to bio-oil, it goes through a series of 5 steps. So first there's the cultivation stage that has an input of light, water, CO2, and nutrients. And the cultivation stage can either occur in open raceway ponds or photobioreactors, and it depends on the type of microalgae chosen to produce the bio-oil. After that, there's the harvesting stage, which includes 2 main steps, the thickening and dewatering. And the main purpose of it is to enhance the biomass recovery from the microalgae. After that, there's the drying stage, which the main purpose of it is to increase the concentration of solids to around 20 to 30%. After that, there's the specific conversion technology. To produce bio-oil in particular, it is the thermochemical conversion technology, which mainly uses thermal energy to chemically produce the bio-oil. And it can either happen through pyrolysis or hydrothermal liquefaction, and I will discuss them further in the next slide. And after that, bio-oil is produced, and it can either be directly combusted to produce electricity, or it could be stabilized and hydrotreated, hence further treated to be used for other applications. And of course, every step here requires energy input. However, it's not shown on the slide here. So when comparing pyrolysis and hydrothermal liquefaction, pyrolysis requires an additional thermal drying step in order to increase the concentration of solids to around 80 to 90%. So the biomass after that is fed into a reactor and is heated to around 400 to 600 degrees Celsius with atmospheric pressure and in the presence of oxygen. After that, it is then cooled for a few seconds. The resultant gas is then cooled for a few seconds and is fed into an electrostatic precipitator. This precipitator basically causes bio-oil to settle down, and it is then collected. The mass yield generally is 29.3% bio-oil, and the remaining substances that are produced are char, gases, and aqueous phases. As for the hydrothermal liquefaction, It does not require an extra thermal drying step like the pyrolysis. The biomass is also preheated, but only to around 150 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. It is then fed into a reactor where it is heated further to 250 to 370 degrees Celsius, but with a larger pressure, so 10 to 25 megapascals for 1 hour. And a catalyst is added to facilitate this conversion. The result is basically 37% bio oil, and the remaining substances that are produced are solids, gases, and an aqueous phase. So as for the environmental impact, it differs between pyrolysis and hydrothermal liquefaction because, as mentioned previously, pyrolysis does require more intensive drying and heating requirements. So as for the greenhouse gas emissions, it was found that the pyrolysis pathway to produce bio-oil requires around 210 grams of CO2 equivalent emissions per megajoules of bio-oil produced. However, the hydrothermal liquefaction pathway only generates, actually it has carbon dioxide sequestered, so it's minus 11.4 grams of CO2 equivalent emissions per megajoules. And a reason for this is because the co-products that are produced are basically recycled and used as nutrients in the microalgal growth stage. As for the energy requirements, pyrolysis is definitely more than hydrothermal liquefaction. The NER was found to be 2.28, whereas the hydrothermal liquefaction was only found to be 1.24. They are both larger than 1, which is undesirable. As for the water requirements, it has intensive water requirements due to mainly the cultivation and harvesting stages that are very water demanding. And it was found that it was around 15.9 to around 120 trillion gallons of water is required per year to displace conventional diesel, basically, in order to produce bio-oil. So now, as for the cost and application, it was found that the downstream processing, which involves the thermochemical conversion and the further stabilizing and hydrotreating, amounts to around 60% of the total production cost. The harvesting only amounts to 20% of the total production costs. And it was found to be around $10.75 to $13.32 needed per gallon produced of bio-oil. And some applications for bio-oil are similar to those previously mentioned by Jenna, which are basically a transportation fuel mainly. And short-term applications could be used for boilers, furnaces, and power stations, but they could also be used for long-term as fuels for turbines and diesel engines. It is important to note, however, that large-scale production of the third-generation bio-oil have not yet been successful, thus they have not yet been commercialized when compared to the other two biofuels that we discussed. So now for our comparative analysis, we first decided to compare our three biofuels with, in terms of a qualitative analysis, and we decided to do that through the conversion technology, which is basically used to estimate the complexity of each technology. And we assume that the technology with greater number of steps needed to produce the biofuel is hence more complex and more undesirable, so unfavorable. As shown in the diagram here on the right, it can be seen that the order of complexity goes from starting with the first generation bioethanol, which is the least complex since it only requires 2 steps, all the way to the third generation bio-oil, which is the most complex and hence unfavorable because it requires around 5 steps. Thus, the most favorable biofuel when it comes to our qualitative analysis, in this case, is bioethanol. Now for our quantitative analysis, we decided to do it based on the greenhouse gas emissions, starting with the base greenhouse gas emissions, which is measured through the carbon footprint of each biofuel. Thus, the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions produced per megajoules of biofuel produced. So as can be seen on the graph, the third generation bio oil using the pyrolysis pathway is the most unfavorable. In fact, based on calculations, it was found that it produced 367.7% more greenhouse gas emissions than bioethanol and 837.5% more emissions than biodiesel. And one reason for this, as mentioned previously, is that basically the reactor requires the burning of gas and char in order to generate energy needed to perform the thermochemical conversions. And as can be seen from this graph, the most favorable biofuel in this case would be bio oil using the hydrothermal liquefaction pathway. However, generally we can see here that the first generation biofuels are way less than that of the pyrolysis, so they can also be more favorable than the bio oil using the pyrolysis pathway. Now Jana will discuss further about the quantitative analysis that we did.
Okay, so to also compare the environmental impact between the three liquid biofuels, we also compared the net energy ratio of the three, which is basically the ratio of energy input into the system to the energy generated from the biofuel produced, which is why we wanted to be less than 1 for it to be desirable. And as mentioned earlier, the NER of the third generation bio oil is higher than 1, and the largest is that of the pyrolysis technique for the third generation bio oil, while the first generation biodiesel has the smallest NER, and it's the only NER less than 1. So when it comes to the net energy ratio, the most favorable biofuel is found to be biodiesel. As for the water requirements, we compared them using the amount of the gallons of water required to produce 1 gallon of each of the three biofuels. And as we can see in this graph on the right, the third generation bio oil requires the largest amount of water. And this is, as mentioned earlier, due to the fact that it requires water for the microalgae growth and cultivation, and it also depends on the geographical location, while the liquid biofuel that requires the least amount of water is the bioethanol, as shown in the graph, which is why it's the most favorable biofuel in this case. And finally, when it comes to the cost of production, we basically compared the cost of production and the selling price of each of the three liquid biofuels. And it was found that the largest production cost was that of the third generation biofuel, and it's actually 19 times more costly than the bioethanol production and 7 times more costly than the biodiesel production. And this due to the fact that it requires an extensive energy and water requirements, and it's generally considered a complex process. So as we can see in this graph, the one with the least cost of production is bioethanol, which makes it again the most favorable biofuel when it comes to economic viability. Lien will now proceed with the limitations and finally finish with the conclusion and recommendation.
So with every study or review paper conducted, it is very essential to take into consideration the limitations of the results that were concluded. So some limitations that we came across were the fact that the data was collected from different sources that may have taken different system boundaries and assumptions. In addition to that, direct and indirect land use change and waste generated were not accounted for all biofuels. And in this case, the land use change is very essential to be taken into consideration when discussing the greenhouse gas emissions because they contribute to a lot. Also, social impacts associated with implementing the biofuels were not considered. Current and future supply of the biofuels were not investigated, and this is important, especially when considering the cost of production and the selling price in order to determine, to do a very appropriate comparison. And finally, the competitiveness of biofuels with conventional fossil fuels were not tackled in depth, so we're not really able to do a comparison when it comes to substituting these biofuels with conventional fossil fuels that already exist. So in conclusion, definitely taking into consideration the limitations that we just discussed, it can be concluded that the first generation biofuels, which are bioethanol and biodiesel, are more favorable to produce than the third generation biofuel, bio-oil. A reason for this is that they overall have fewer emissions, less energy and water requirements, and reduced production costs based on the comparative analysis that we just discussed. And also we can conclude that bioethanol can be considered more promising than biodiesel. One reason for this is that it has a lower production cost, lower water requirements, and is less complex to produce. Some recommendations that can be considered for future studies is performing a comparative analysis of one biofuel produced from first, second, and third generation feedstocks. That way we would be able to basically determine the different effectiveness of the biofuel when considering different
Do you hear me? I think there is a problem. Is Lynn talking or Jana?
I
She's not
can't hear
talking.
Lynn. Yeah.
Yes, there is a problem. Anyway, it's fine because this is the end.
I cut off? Can you hear me
It's
now?
fine, just for 30 seconds maybe. It's fine, it's fine.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I will start with students' questions. So any questions from students? Yalla, you should ask questions. Did you understand everything? No, so it seems that Lynn and Jana are good teachers. Okay, so I will start with my questions. First, Jana, can you go to slide 22, please?
Okay.
So as I understood, you collected data from several work. It's not from one work. So for example, here to construct this graph, you did research from several work to do it, or in one work you had this comparison?
No, we basically did this comparison. So we collected data of bioethanol from a certain paper and biodiesel from a certain paper and bio-oil from another paper. And then we did this graph. Yeah.
Okay. And in general, in each work, sometimes the work was experimental, and other work it was calculation, or let's say in all it was one type.
Generally, we tried to be consistent with all the papers. So they were all experimental and research-based.
Okay. And please, can you just give some details about the difference and what are the main reasons of difference in CO2 emissions between these types?
Okay, so basically for the third generation biofuel, the main contributor for greenhouse gas emissions is the energy requirements. So in the reactors, we require high energy, which requires basically the burning of gas and char, which results in high greenhouse gas emissions. And also for bioethanol and biodiesel, as mentioned previously with Jana, biodiesel, it was because of the land use change. And for bioethanol, basically every single small step requires an input of small energy in the liquefaction process and in the hydrolysis process. So they all require minimum amount of energy, which basically results in the greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you go to the other slides?